Funding for Split Rock, the Superior Light, was provided by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.
Lake Superior has it all. Serene, uninhabited shoreline. Spectacular cliffs. Crystal clear waters. But don't let the calm surface fool you. The big lake can quickly change from calm to calamitous, especially when the winds blow from the northeast. You can trace the construction of Split Rock Lighthouse on the Minnesota North Shore of Lake Superior to a legendary November storm more than a century ago.
A lot of people ask about how the storm got its name, and it does have a lot of different names. The storm of the century, the Matafas storm, quite often I'll refer to it as the storm that built the lights.
November 28th of 1905 saw a huge storm that put 29 of those vessels down or damaged out there and took the lives of 11 men that were working on those boats. And so that's why Congress allocated the $75,000 to build this place.
It was an aid to navigation, a beacon for the captains who relied as much on gut and experience as they did on the crude navigational tools of the day. And while it no longer serves its intended purpose, today it educates visitors and preserves a part of the region's history while standing in tribute to the memory of those who have perished on the lake.
John H. McCarthy, first mate. James A. Pratt, second mate.
While it's difficult to improve on the severe beauty of the lake, Split Rock has done its part to keep visitors coming back to the shining Big Sea water.
Did they anticipate Highway 61 really blowing through there and bringing all these tourists up? I don't know, but kind of the notes even from the contractors in the early days of the lighthouse, people went there, people stopped there. They made an effort to get off the road as it was, to get in there.
Split Rock, to me, is just the keeper of so many wonderful stories, not only for tourists, but just for the history of Minnesota as a whole.
It's located on the most fantastic 20 miles of shoreline on all of Lake Superior.
This location is phenomenal. Everybody can recognize Split Rock Lighthouse from anywhere in the country.
More than a century after her construction, she still towers over the world's largest lake, living up to the title, Split Rock, the Superior Light.
I'd just like to say welcome to Split Rock Lighthouse on behalf of the Minnesota Historical Society. Originally, this place was built by the U.S. Lighthouse Service, which was a subdivision of the Department of Commerce, so it was done by the federal government. Interestingly enough, finished ahead of schedule and below budget. So, can happen. You may be wondering, why was this built, when it was built, and the reason is because, of course, of iron ore. The boats out here, steam-powered vessels, underpowered, overloaded, were plying these waters. You would have seen a lot of them every day. There would probably be something on the order of 15, 20 boats that might go down past here in those days, of course carrying a nice plume of smoke from the coal that they were burning.
At the turn of the 20th century, ship traffic on Lake Superior was escalating at a remarkable rate. The port of Duluth Superior was busier in an 8-month shipping season than New York Harbor was in an entire year. The rich ores of Minnesota's Mesabi Range fueled the increased traffic.
Back at that time, a little over 100 years ago, instead of getting like 1,000 or maybe 1,200 boats into Duluth Superior Harbor, we were getting 3,500 arrivals. And that is just an enormous amount of traffic.
In the decade before Split Rock Lighthouse was commissioned, vessels doubled in length and their carrying capacity increased fourfold as steel hulls replaced wood. United States Steel alone had a fleet of 112 steel freighters, the largest group of American ships anywhere in the world.
They had roughly 100 ships in the fleet, and if they had insured all of them, it would have been an enormous expense.
Not only were most lake vessels uninsured, they were often overloaded to maximize profits. The steam-powered Lakers of the day were no match for what would become known as the storm of the century.
One of the things that the masters knew at that time was, in 1905, was that in Duluth, in the late fall, the November time, if you got a bad storm, it'd last 2 or 3 days and it would be over. You never got 2 bad back-to-back storms. Basically, the storm passed through and it kind of got hooked out on Lake Superior and came back again after having picked up a bunch of energy from Lake Superior. So the second time around, it was really, really a horrific storm.
Thinking the worst had passed, shipmasters waiting out the weather in ports around Lake Superior sailed their vessels into the teeth of the storm. By the time the big blow was over, 29 vessels had been damaged or lost in the nor'easter. The great storm of November 28, 1905, was one to be long remembered. Gale force winds in excess of 60 miles an hour blew for more than half a day. Vessels caught in the narrow western end of Lake Superior struggled to stay off the rocky north shore, but for many, it was a losing battle. Multiplying the risks, steamers of the day often towed a barge in what was known as a consort system.
So it would be a steamer and a barge together. Sometimes they came into Duluth together. Sometimes they would drop off the barge at 2 harbors, and tugs like the Edna G would go out and get the barge and bring it into the dock, and they'd load the barge there while the steamer was loading in Duluth, and then the steamer would come back and pick up the barge off 2 harbors.
Among the casualties was the barge Madeira, undertowed by the steamer William Edenborn near Beaver Bay. As the Edenborn struggled to make headway in the gale, the tow line parted and the Madeira drifted helplessly toward the 80-foot cliff at Gold Rock Point. The 436-foot Madeira crashed against the point as huge waves battered her to pieces. 9 of her 10-member crew survived, thanks to the heroics of a sailor who managed somehow to climb up the cliff, throwing a line down to the crew on the battered vessel. Meanwhile, the captain of the Edenborn increased speed in an attempt to make headway against the relentless waves. Disoriented by the snow and darkness, he steered the vessel directly toward the shoreline near Split Rock River, where it struck, bow first. The ship's back was broken, and a crewman lost his life when he fell into a hold while scrambling toward the forward canal. Near Encampment Island, about 6 miles north of 2 harbors, another drama was playing out in the raging storm. The 5-year-old Lafayette, purpose-built to carry iron ore for U.S. Steel, was towing the barge Manila on its way to Duluth. Blinded by the driving snow and darkness, the captain had no idea of the ship's position until he heard breakers hitting shore to starboard. But it was too late as the Lafayette slammed into the shoreline and the Manila piled into her stern. The bow of the steamer took the brunt of the storm and was broken into pieces, while the Manila settled into a slightly more protected cove. Despite the damage, only 1 Lafayette crew member perished on this terrible night. The stern section of the ship was eventually salvaged, and the lightly damaged Manila returned to service. Near Duluth, the Crescent City lost a battle with the gale force winds. She was another of the vessels owned by the Pittsburgh Steamship Company, a subsidiary of United States Steel. Driven into the shoreline near Leicester River, The Crescent City crew fared better than the others. They managed to make it to shore, clambering across a ladder lowered from the deck to the rocky shoreline. Among the shipwrecks, the steamer Matafa made the biggest headlines, and her crew suffered terribly. The vessel was making a run for the safety of Duluth Harbor when a swell dashed her against the South Pier, beginning a dramatic life-and-death struggle witnessed by thousands of Duluthians.
What happened with the Matafa is that it was one of a series of accidents that happened right at the Duluth Ship Canal. People in town had gotten the word about accidents and big waves and all of that, and so literally thousands of people were down there in the Canal Park area and watched the Matafa in the process of wrecking.
Duluth photographer Hugh Mackenzie captured a number of remarkable images of the Matafa as she struck the pier and later foundered just a few hundred yards from shore. The life-saving crew tried in vain to get a line to the boat, but the tremendous waves made it impossible. All through the night, Duluth residents watched helplessly from the beach. Some of the crew managed to find shelter in the captain's cabin in the bow of the ship, where they burned furniture for warmth. Others, trapped on the stern, were turned back time and again by huge waves that pounded the vessel through the night. The next morning, when the storm subsided, lifesavers were able to reach the ship and rescue 15 of the crew. But 9 men stranded on the stern, without shelter, perished in a gale that is remembered even today as the Matafa Storm. The shipwrecks of 1905 put quite a dent in the spiraling profits of the steel industry, and Pittsburgh Steamship quickly went to work on a campaign for a government-financed light and fog signal near Split Rock.
The shipping companies, basically represented by the Lake Carriers Association, which still exists today, made up of vessel owners. They were a real good lobbying group in Washington, had a lot of power.
By the time the Lake Carriers Association met at its annual meeting in 1907, the most important members of this powerful group were lobbying Congress for new navigational aids on the Great Lakes. And at the top of their list was a lighthouse at Split Rock. Decades before the rapid increase of commercial shipping traffic on the lake, Split Rock had been noted as a favorable location for a lighthouse.
There was a survey that was done of the North Shore in 1854, and the surveyor at that time came all the way up the shore and identified this as one of the best spots in this area for a lighthouse, up on this particular rock even.
That was just really a good spot. It would tell you, coming down from Isle Royal and coming across from the Apostle Islands or north of the Apostle Islands, it was really good. And if you were, way north of Two Harbors, you'd find out when you could see the Split Rock Light, and same if you were too far south, you would see the lights at either at Two Harbors or at Duluth.
The storms of 1905 were a powerful reminder of the need for more lighthouses on Lake Superior. Of even more importance, as far as the Lighthouse Board was concerned, was the necessity of a fog signal at Split Rock. The board noted the unusual magnetic properties of mineral deposits near the shore, which deflected the compass needle, making navigation at night or in fog hazardous. The political clout of the Lake Carriers Association prevailed, and funding passed routinely through the 59th Congress.
By 1907, there was an appropriation made through Congress for $75,000 for this lighthouse, and that was part of a package of $500,000 for other lighthouses and aids to navigation on the Great Lakes.
The task of designing and building the new light station was given to a young junior engineer who was working on another assignment to the northeast of Split Rock.
Ralph Russell Tinkham, who was an engineer for the U.S. Lighthouse Service, began plans as he was completing Isle Royal Lighthouse, Rock of Ages Lighthouse. He began working on Split Rock Lighthouse, and he was actually working out of the Apostle Islands and up at Rock of Ages.
In his spare time, while he was doing that Rock of Ages project, and that was an enormous task, a unique lighthouse, he was finishing his designs for Split Rock Lighthouse.
The Lighthouse Board had selected a site along the North Shore known locally as Stony Point, 2.5 miles northeast of the Split Rock River. It was a fine site for a lighthouse, but a difficult location to build on. With the only access by boat, the first challenge was hauling building supplies to the top of the cliff. In May of 1909, Tinkham arrived with the contractor L.D. Campbell and Son of Duluth. They assembled a steam-powered hoist and derrick at the edge of the vertical cliff, 110 feet above the lake. All supplies and construction material for the job, 310 tons in total, were hauled up to the worksite by this method, from barges anchored at the bottom of the cliff.
In weather like this, where it's dead calm, they could pull right up to the base of the rock and unload supplies straight up off the deck of the boat. But if it got to be even 1 foot waves, they'd have to back off and wait till it calmed down again to finish unloading.
Workers immediately began the task of drilling and dynamiting for the building foundations.
And it was a difficult place to build because it's solid rock here. They had to drill into this stuff, put dynamite charges, and shear the rock up to make trenches into which the building's footings could be poured.
Nearby, they erected the 3 wooden storage barns that would serve as temporary living quarters. Many of the workers stayed in canvas tents, which offered little shelter from the elements and even less from the frequent showers of rock and debris from the blasting.
And there's some stories during construction where they had issues with weather, and they also had some issues with, of course, they had to do dynamite blasting and some problems with flying rock and debris, and having to make sure that things were stabilized for that.
Once the foundation work was completed, successive groups of carpenters, concrete workers, steel workers, and bricklayers arrived by boat at the remote site. By November 1909, when work stopped for the winter, the 3 keepers' houses were finished, and the steel girders of the lighthouse rose from the rocky outcropping above Lake Superior. The workers returned the next spring to continue work on the light, which was finished in late July. They had labored in virtual isolation, living on the edge of a stone cliff for a total of 13 months, with only the occasional supply boat to connect them to the rest of the world. The structures they skillfully crafted fulfilled the vision of Ralph Russell Tinkham and made a statement about the status of Lake Superior.
Split Rock is a light station. We have the lighthouse, but then all the other ancillary buildings that really kind of almost overboard in the keepers' quarters. We had 3 complete and separate brick buildings. The barns or garage buildings that were behind them. You had the fog signal building, the oil house. It's a big light station. Perhaps in 1910 at that time, maybe bigger than it needed to be, but it was really a showcase. It was kind of saying to the world of navigation that the Great Lakes are important, and particularly Lake Superior.
If you're ready, if you'll follow me on the sidewalk, we'll walk on up to the top of the site up there.
Are we going inside the lighthouse?
Yep, that'll be just like the dessert. We'll be doing that last.
And going to the top.
And going to the top, yep. This is what we call a bearing light. The only purpose it had was this was a known location on the landscape. So if you have this and another lighthouse, and you'd have one out there on Devil's Island, from those 2 you can actually triangulate your position on the water.
The new light station, towering 130 feet above Lake Superior, was one of the most complete in the country. The head keeper would be in charge of tending the light, operating the fog signal when needed, and maintaining numerous pieces of equipment necessary for the job. The honor was given to Orrin Pete Young, who began his career in 1901, serving as assistant keeper at lighthouses along Lake Superior's Michigan coast. Young's salary was $624 his first season as head keeper at Split Rock. He arrived on July 20th, 1910, with about a week and a half to get used to the machinery before the official opening date.
It was 10 buildings and 7.5 acres, so there was quite a bit to be responsible for. The assistant keepers didn't actually show up until early August, so he lit the beacon for the first time on July 31st, and he was here by himself that night. He was the lone keeper for that first night.
Keeper Young lit the kerosene vapor lamp at 6:30 on the evening of July 31st, several hours before sunset. No doubt he wanted to be sure that everything was working properly for the official first night of operation of the Split Rock Beacon. That first evening must have been a long one for Young, as he climbed the circular stairway every 2 hours to crank up the cast iron weights that kept the light turning. He marked the momentous occasion with a few simple words in the lighthouse log.
Keeper's log, July 31st, 1910. Put light in commission at 6:30 p.m.
It's hard to get a good impression from his journals that the keepers were required to write daily entries into a journal, and most of his say general duties at light station, man of few words.
Within a few days, the first and second keepers assigned to Split Rock arrived and soon fell into the regular routine. During the night, the keeper and his 2 assistants rotated 4-hour watches, and during the day kept a close watch on the weather as part of their 8-hour workday. If visibility dropped below 5 miles, the giant gasoline air compressors would be started, and the deep bellow of the fog signal would be heard every 20 seconds. Because of the remote location of the lighthouse, the early keepers had to be resourceful. Besides keeping the essential lighthouse equipment in good repair, the men also had to be plumbers, carpenters, gardeners, and road builders. They painted, hauled water, pulled stumps, and hauled in loads of dirt for landscaping.
Making any kind of general repairs like window leaking or replace a broken window pane, painting, mopping, just all kinds of stuff that kept the keeper busy during the day, plus the usual household chores.
In addition, the head keeper had to keep close tabs on the essential goods needed to keep the station in operation.
That you had ordered the supplies that you needed so far in advance that they would actually come, because the lighthouse depot, where things were held in reserve, was actually in Detroit. So you had to plan way ahead for things that you needed, because it took a while to get the message there, and then it would be on the next boat whenever that came.
Lighthouse tender boats tended to come about once or twice a summer, and depending on what needs the light station had, if there was major work to be done, they'd be here more often and bring, say, an engineer or somebody from Detroit. But on a regular basis, they'd resupply them with coal or gasoline or kerosene once or twice a season.
During construction of the lighthouse, a dock and boathouse were built to the southwest of the light in a small rocky cove. The depth was not sufficient for the tender boats to dock there, so supplies had to be hauled up using the hoist and derrick from a barge or skiff anchored below. The lighthouse service furnished a 16-foot boat the keepers could row to pick up mail at Beaver Bay, the nearest permanent village 5 miles northeast of the station.
Usually they made trips into Beaver Bay about once a week during the summer to get mail, to get any supplies from the Matson store, a little general store.
To make the weekly mail trips a little easier, Pete Young rigged up a sail on the small round-bottom skiff. He warned the assistant keepers never to tie the end of the sail down for fear an unexpected burst of wind would tip the boat over. In October of 1910, Young sent the 2 assistant keepers to a logging camp on the Split Rock River where they were to pick up the light station's mail.
The keepers didn't come back from their mail run. The next day, Keeper Young went looking for them, found the skiff a couple hundred yards offshore. I had commercial fishermen go out and get it and drag it back in, and sure enough, the sail was tied off to the gunwale. The 2 assistants drowned.
Young searched the shoreline for days, but the bodies of the assistant keepers were never found. It was the only loss of life during the history of operations at Split Rock. Although the U.S. Lighthouse Service was a civil service agency of the federal government, in many ways it was run like a branch of the military. Head Keeper Young had full responsibility for the day-to-day operations at Split Rock, but he had very little leeway in how he got the job done. He exchanged a constant stream of correspondence with his superiors in Detroit, not only to receive needed supplies, but to make even the slightest change in procedure at the lighthouse. And if Young wanted to leave the light station for more than 6 hours at a time, he needed formal permission.
They did have a lot of regulations, and of course when you think of the responsibility for the safety and well-being of all the mariners, they had to follow regulations, and they had to have pretty strict discipline on when to turn the light on, when to turn it off, how much fuel to use, what to report, what not to report, what they were allowed to do in their homes and out on the light station itself.
Keepers were required to keep detailed records of supplies on hand, hours the light and fog signal were in operation, and expenses incurred. Entries were made on a daily basis in a ledger, which became a permanent fixture on a desk in the dining room. Even though they were hundreds of miles away from their superiors, keepers had good reason to keep up with their daily tasks. They knew that a lighthouse inspector could arrive at the dock on any day of the season.
It was kind of a contest and kind of a thing between the inspector and the different head keepers that they'd try to sneak up on them. Here what they do is come early morning and come from the Apostle Islands out of the east and come with the rising sun and kind of stay hidden in the bright sunlight.
The keepers enlisted the help of their families to keep an eye out for the inspector, even offering a monetary incentive to the first to spot a lighthouse tender boat on the horizon.
So the kids had a standing offer from the guys who were operating the place here, 50 cents to the child who first saw the little pennant on the ship that was carrying, or the boat, excuse me, that was carrying the guy that was coming in, the inspector then, to look at the place.
In an interview recorded by the Minnesota Historical Society, Keeper Young's daughter Grace told of how her father had to be at the ready for a surprise inspection.
But everything had to be spotless. The floor in the bottom of the tower and the fog signal floor, then they had to be dressed in uniform. So I would run upstairs into my father's room, lay out his uniform, put it along, and he hardly had time to dress in his uniform. He'd be buttoning up his shirt while I'd be lacing up his shoes. And that was inspection. And they inspected everything. They looked in the pantries, they looked in the clothes closets, they looked in the oven and the stove to see if the stove was clean.
One of the advantages of life at Split Rock was that the station had been built with families in mind. A comfortable, solidly built home was provided for each of the 3 keepers. Having your family so close by must have been comforting for the assistants who were assigned to Split Rock.
Usually it was 3 families that lived here, and those 3 families were pretty isolated from the rest of the population along the North Shore, so they had to get along well and live together pretty closely.
But during his 18 years as head keeper, Pete Young's family never lived at the light station.
You know, it's interesting. He's one of the few keepers who it seems like his wife wasn't that interested in living at a light station, even one as nice as this one. It was inaccessible. She'd rather be in town. At first it was Michigan that they came from, around Marquette and Munising, and a couple years later they actually moved to 2 harbors 20 miles from here, and his wife and family usually stayed in town and came out here for a few weeks in the summer.
As Young's children grew older, they made frequent visits to see their father, often on the passenger and package steamer America. The America had a regular route up and down the North Shore, making the mail run and carrying needed supplies to the fishing villages along the way. Daughter Grace, in particular, would stay for long periods of time, cooking for her father and doing other chores around the house. And she was given additional responsibilities by her father.
And no doctors up there, so that meant that the head keeper, which was my father, he had to be doctor. And that was very interesting. When I went up there, the first thing my father says to me, I'll never forget it, Gracie, you'll have to get acquainted with the doctor book. He says, make yourself very familiar with that doctor book. Because he says, you'll be called on to use it. If anyone needs anything, he says, you can hand out the medicine, but read the directions first. The doctor book would be about 8 inches wide and about maybe 10 inches high and about 3 inches thick. Well, I tell you, I studied that. I hustled with the housework, and I read that. So I had to be doctor when it was necessary, and bandage up little scrapes or skins on one of the assistant's wives' children, because my dad was supposed to do it, but I did it, so he didn't have to leave his painting job to come down and do that.
When the duties of the day were done, there was still the night watch to be stood by Keeper Young and his assistants. If the night was clear and the fog signal wasn't needed, Young and his daughter could relax for a time.
My father's night watch was from 8 o'clock until midnight. And I was sat up with him. We could sit in the living room and watch the light revolve. And then at 12 o'clock he had to go up, and he wound up. Then he went in the tower, in the fog signal where the day log was kept. And he rode up for the day in there.
The only break from the daily routine was when a tender boat arrived with supplies or when the occasional party of travelers came ashore. In fact, Split Rock recorded its first guest just 6 weeks after the light was commissioned. In his logbook, Keeper Young noted that a party of visitors had stopped by from Split Rock, the nearby logging camp. But it would be 15 years before the construction of Highway 61 opened the North Shore to a steady stream of tourists. That's not to say the keepers were without neighbors. Just to the west of the lighthouse, in a cove known as Little Two Harbors, a small fishing village was home to several families. The well-protected cove had a dock for commercial fishing boats and a handful of tar paper shacks built right on the rocky shoreline. The keepers and their nearest neighbors soon struck up a mutually beneficial relationship.
They would come up and get haircuts. Pete Young would give the fishermen haircuts, and he'd come down here and visit them once in a while and share fish with them. And so that was their closest neighbors.
Some of them became hunting companions, finding a bountiful harvest in the nearby countryside. Beginning in the fall of 1915, a few of the hardy Norwegian fishermen helped make a significant improvement at the light station.
This is a pretty neat spot because this, prior to 1916, all there was here was a stairway that went from the lighthouse down to the boat landing, the dock, and there was actually a boathouse at the bottom of the stairway here.
Even with the stairway, it was a long, difficult climb from the boat dock to the station, so keepers continued to use the hazardous old construction derrick to bring supplies up from the lake.
They came in under budget on the original construction. They spent $72,000 and they had $75,000 allocated. So they wanted to build this tramway, which is actually an elevated, inclined miniature railway.
Along with the fishermen from Little Two Harbors, laborers were hired from Beaver Bay to begin work on the tramway. The men lived and worked on the site through the fall and came back the following summer to finish the work. All of the concrete was mixed and poured by hand into forms fashioned into the steep hillside. It was back-breaking labor, but the men hired for the job were more than willing to do it for $2 a day, plus meals cooked by Pete Young himself. At the top, a brick tram house was constructed that housed a 5-horsepower gasoline engine attached to a steel cable that hauled the tram car up the 100-foot incline.
They'd pull up with the motor, they'd pull the cart up with a cable to this point and then unhook it from the cable and turn it and run it up by hand and push it up the last 10-foot incline on the pillars right up into the light station and deliver all the supplies right to the oil house or the dwellings, wherever they needed them.
This rare film shows the tram in action, hauling a load up from the dock along the steep tramway.
It was effective, and this isn't the only lighthouse that had them. Of course, Raspberry Island and a lot of the other island or lighthouses, especially on the islands around the Great Lakes, had some sort of tramway that they could get supplies up the hill. Tramway itself was used from 1916 until by 1934 it was kind of outdated, because by that time Highway 61 had been built past here. They had built a road into the light station from the highway.
The tram house still stands amidst the remains of hand-poured concrete abutments on the hillside. The encroaching forest has nearly hidden its remnants, made obsolete long ago by an advancing highway that opened up the North Shore to tourism. And the changes brought by the highway were just beginning for Split Rock, its keepers, and the light station's mission. Split Rock became an even more solitary spot in late December when the keepers left the station for the winter months. The houses would be closed up, the cisterns and pipes emptied, the fog building and lighthouse itself secured for the long, cold winter. And then the keepers, like those at island stations around Lake Superior, would wait expectantly for the tender boats to pick them up.
And it was always, well, when is the tender going to come to pick me up and get me off the island? And it's like, are we going to send the family first and then me follow? Or are we all going together? How much of my household do I have to move?
The harsh November gales leading up to winter wreaked havoc on the light station's dock and boathouse. The dock was at the mercy of the northeastern winds and had to be replaced 3 times during the station's first 7 years of operation. Each spring was a renewal, as well as a transition at light stations across Lake Superior. The lighthouse service boats would bring the keepers and their families back to their posts for the beginning of the new shipping season. There would often be new faces, as first and second assistants moved up the ranks. 1928 marked just such a transition at Split Rock. Head keeper Pete Young had reached the mandatory retirement age of 70. He was replaced by Franklin J. Koval, who was serving his second stint at Split Rock.
His first appointment here was 1913, and he was a second assistant keeper. And then he made a transfer to Two Harbors Lighthouse and a couple other lighthouses, and came back as first assistant keeper and worked here beginning in 1924.
Frank Koval's experience at lighthouses and time under Pete Young made for an easy transition to head keeper. But nothing could have prepared him for the changes the construction of Highway 61 would bring to Split Rock.
So the highway actually opened in 1925, but before that there was this kind of rutted, almost impassable road that ran inland. And it wasn't until folks in Two Harbors, some of the businessmen, decided that, hey, we have this great resource, this beautiful Lake Superior, why don't we try to get a road right along the shore?
The new highway changed everything for the light keepers at Split Rock and the existence for the families, because as soon as that highway opened up in 1924, it opened up the North Shore to tourism, and it became a tourist stop for everybody.
Construction was difficult on the rocky shore, and places like Silver Creek Cliff and the Gooseberry River presented challenges to construction crews of the day.
And as you can imagine, construction was really tough. They did it by horses. The blasting killed a number of men. It was really an arduous task to put Highway 61 through.
The North Shore Highway opened in 1924, but it would still be another year before a crude road was built down to the boathouse. In 1926, Split Rock was featured on the cover of a brochure touting the Lake Superior International Highway, complete with a fanciful artistic interpretation of the newly accessible lighthouse. The first visitors began to trickle in over the rough trail, but it was several years later before a road was finally cut right to the back door of the lighthouse itself.
It wasn't right away. It wasn't until around 1930 when there was an access road into the light station from the highway, and it wasn't until 1935 that the CCC built a really good, up-to-standard access road.
It was the heyday of touring on the open road, and the newly mobile citizens were eager to see the sights of the North Shore.
I love seeing some of these old photos and some of the old footage, newsreel footage of people traveling up the North Shore in these old cars. And what we don't understand is that it was such a big adventure for these people. Driving was a novelty, and a road trip was a big adventure.
Did they anticipate Highway 61 really blowing through there and bringing all these tourists up I don't know, but kind of the notes from even from the contractors in the early days of the lighthouse, that people went there, people stopped there. They made an effort to get off the road as it was, to get in there to the light, to see what was there.
By the early 1930s, visitation at the lighthouse averaged about 5,000 people a year, and the keepers devised a policy to deal with the growing influx of tourists. Visiting hours were established, and a keeper escorted each guest. In the early days, visitors were even allowed on the lantern deck until scratches began showing up on the lens.
People spoiled it for themselves by not behaving when they were up here, so then they said, okay, it's off limits from then on.
So you can imagine those guys trying to do their job, trying to keep the lighthouse operational, and then during the day dealing with 500 people a day or so coming in to visit the light stations.
Keeper Koval had asked for fences to provide some privacy and protect his wife's flower garden, but the service instead told him to install warning signs, which proved ineffective.
Especially Keeper Koval's children, Beulah and Eilina, talked about how their mother would be upset with visitors coming through and picking her flowers, having parents put their kids on their shoulders and looking in the windows, and or people walking into their house while they were eating dinner.
While not getting his wish to install privacy fences, the lighthouse service agreed with Koval's plan to build a safety fence near the tower. In 1938, Keeper Koval estimated 100,000 people visited Split Rock, an astounding total that was 5 times the number of any other station in the lighthouse service. Split Rock had become a showcase, and to deal with the growing crowds, an additional keeper was appointed for the summer months.
I think it was really such a surprise for some of the light keepers to have to deal with tourists and try to shoo them away from their houses and try to maintain some semblance of a normal life while you have these tourists that are coming to see this place.
And more changes were coming for the keepers at Split Rock. In 1939, the lighthouse service was absorbed by the United States Coast Guard under a directive of President Franklin Roosevelt.
It was kind of an odd transition because the old keepers were allowed to stay as lighthouse service employees and retire out of the lighthouse service. So there were many times that there were, and here at Split Rock in the 1940s, there were lighthouse service keepers working right next to Coast Guardsmen.
The Coast Guard recognized the value of Split Rock, touting it as probably the most visited lighthouse in the United States. And a smart businessman saw an opportunity to capitalize on that fame.
Clyde Adams bought the land between the lighthouse and the highway, and just outside the gate to the light station, just off of the lighthouse reservation property, he built a gift shop in 1942.
Tourists looking for something to eat, a cold drink, or a souvenir couldn't miss the shop, which literally had the market cornered.
This was certainly a focal point for tourists, and people who wanted to make a buck knew where the tourists were going to be, and they obviously planned well. Various resorts started to spring up. That great gift shop that was right outside the gates here at Split Rock, that sprang up, and of course that also led to another place that you can still see remnants of it along the highway, the Split Rock Trading Post. That's still there with that strange tower. They're kind of the stockade-looking place.
Under the management of the Coast Guard, Split Rock saw some improvements in early 1940. The old kerosene vapor lamp in the light was replaced by a 1,000-watt bulb, and the lens was rotated by electric motor. The big old gasoline compressors were removed from the fog signal building, which also received electric power. In 1944, Franklin Koval, now serving as a civilian keeper in the Coast Guard, reached the mandatory retirement age of 70 and moved off the station he had supervised since 1928.
It was a change in name, but I think there was a real change in philosophy on the value of the lighthouse service, or the lighthouses in general. Coast Guard knew that it was important, but there was such a change right around that time too in technology, that radar was coming into being, electricity was being used for a lot of the lights.
By the end of World War II, technology was making light stations like Split Rock obsolete. But the attention it received from tourists kept the station operating long after its value as an aid to navigation had passed.
They did phase out the fog signal in 1961, but all during the 60s they, I think, pretty much kept it open and kept it an active light because it was such a popular tourist attraction. It was a show place for the Coast Guard.
Finally, in 1969, after 59 years in service to the mariners on Lake Superior, the Coast Guard made the decision to decommission the light at Split Rock. Even before the closing, the state of Minnesota saw the value of saving the light station at Split Rock. The state acquired the site from the federal government, and in 1971, it opened to the public as a new state park. In 1976, another transition put Split Rock on a path of preservation in the capable hands of the Minnesota Historical Society.
We work more in cultural resources than in natural resources, so then it was decided that Split Rock Lighthouse would be part of that program and would become a state historic site within a state park. So now there's 25 acres that's the light station itself, and the area right surrounding it that's a state historic site and administered by the Minnesota Historical Society. And then the 2,200 acres that surrounds it is Split Rock Lighthouse State Park.
By the mid-1980s, nearly 200,000 people a year were visiting Split Rock, drawn by the beauty of Lake Superior and the stories of the keepers.
Lighthouses everywhere draw people, and I think they have, from the beginning. Everybody wants to know who the keeper is and meet the family, and how do you live in this isolation, and where do your supplies come from, where does your drinking water come from, do you have electricity, all of those kinds of things.
That'll be just like the dessert.
So it is a pristine, intact light station. We talk about what life would have been like for the early lighthouse service as well as for the Coast Guard. And we've also got the lens in place.
That sparkling lens is without a doubt one of the top draws at Split Rock. Its craftsmanship and beauty still awe visitors more than 100 years after it was installed at Split Rock.
It's one of the things that I find just remarkable in working with it is the quality of the workmanship. No computer-aided drafting or no computer-aided work of any kind, of course, at that time. Just guys with a lot of skill and a lot of patience and a lot of craftsmanship to make these.
Welcome, come on in.
A tour is not complete without a climb to the lens deck, where the clockwork mechanism still turns in perfect time.
The lens that we have turning here is the original. It's a third order lens, one of the larger lenses put in a lighthouse on Lake Superior. It's 4.5 feet tall. Just the lens itself weighs 2.5 tons, and it's sitting on a rotating lens table. And that table weighs another 2 tons. So what you have turning here is 4.5 tons of metal and glass. What it turns on is a bearing of mercury. This round pot holds 7 quarts of mercury. That acts as a bearing and also lubricant, supporting that 4.5 tons of weight.
You can see this seam right here and right here. So this section right here, this pie-shaped piece, would have been one of the pieces they would have packed into the crates that were shipped here, of course, on the ocean. And then when they arrived, you can see the bolts here. They would have gone ahead and put those in. And they sent along 2 French technicians to oversee the assembly of this to make sure that the Americans got it correctly put together.
Clockworks the keepers use.
The tour guides turned keepers who man the lighthouse today crank the cast iron weights the same way it was done in the 1920s. And they polish the Fresnel lens with loving care so that it may shine another 100 years.
The lens was purchased from the Barbier Bernard Turenne Company in Paris. The Lighthouse Service paid a little over $10,000 for it, but now it's priceless. Lenses like this just aren't made anymore.
The beauty of the lens complements its location, a sentinel standing guard high above Lake Superior.
It's located on the most fantastic 20 miles of shoreline on all of Lake Superior.
And I think that's part of what makes Split Rock so unique is this location is phenomenal. I mean, everybody can recognize Split Rock Lighthouse from anywhere in the country.
Look how beautiful it is. It's just stunning.
There's hardly a bad picture or view of the lighthouse that you can have. It's just really spectacular.
As a photographer, you couldn't get a better lighthouse to take pictures of. Just the way the light falls on it and being on top of the high cliff. Being on Lake Superior, the climate is always creating a different atmosphere, a different lighting, the moon and sunrise at different locations throughout the year.
For Dennis O'Hara, it's never a bad day for a trip to Split Rock, but it took plenty of patience and perseverance to get his favorite shot of the lighthouse.
The full moonrise in January is the only time of year that you can get the full moon rising behind the lighthouse. And so that one night, assuming that it's clear, the moon comes up the backside of the cliff and then all of a sudden appears right behind the lighthouse, and it silhouettes just into a beautiful picture.
A mere half-mile northeast of the lighthouse, history lies just below the surface of Lake Superior. There, at the base of Gold Rock Point, the ghostly remains of the Madeira can still be seen beneath the waves. Swimming out from shore, scuba divers can get a closer look at the scattered wreckage. Wreckage that bears witness to the powerful storm that led to the construction of Split Rock Lighthouse. It's hard to imagine this towering cliff on the edge of Lake Superior without its buff-colored crown. Countless photographs have been taken of it over the years, but its true purpose remains at the heart of the Minnesota Historical Society's efforts to preserve its legacy. Every year since 1985, site manager Lee Radzak has presided over a solemn ceremony in honor of the most well-known tragedy on the Great Lakes.
It is referred to as the muster of the last watch, and it honors the entire crew by name. To this, we have added a 30th and final toll for all the lost sailors on Lake Superior. We will now muster the last watch of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Ernest M. McSorley, Master. John H. McCarthy, First Mate. James A. Pratt, Second Mate.
And as the bells chime for each man lost in the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, Split Rock's light shines one more time for the vessels and their crews on Lake Superior.
Funding for Split Rock, the Superior Light, was provided by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.